Margaret, a 62-year-old mother, had always believed that her only son, Michael, was the greatest blessing of her life. That morning, she baked his favorite chocolate cake, just as she had done countless times when he was a child. She wanted to surprise him at work, to remind him that no matter how busy life became, he was still her little boy in her eyes. When she arrived at his office parking lot, she saw his car sitting quietly in the corner. A playful idea crossed her mind: she would hide in the back seat with the cake, and when Michael opened the door, she would jump out with a laugh, just like old times. It was innocent, almost childlike, a mother's simple gesture of love. Margaret crouched down in the back seat, carefully holding the cake box on her lap. Her heart raced with excitement at the thought of Michael's surprised smile. But within minutes, the sound of footsteps approached. She recognized Michael's voice instantly, deep, hurried, familiar. What she didn't expect was the sharp, impatient tone of Vanessa, his wife, who walked beside him. They got into the car, and as the engine started, Margaret froze. Then she heard it, words that pierced through her like knives. "We need to make it look like an accident," Vanessa whispered. Michael's reply was cold, calculated. "Don't worry. If we plan it right, no one will ever suspect a thing. She'll be gone, and we'll finally get the money." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. At first, she thought she had misheard, but the conversation grew clearer, darker. Vanessa spoke of timing, of opportunity, of how easy it would be to stage a crash. Michael didn't argue, he agreed, even added details. The cake trembled in Margaret's hands as her world began to shatter. The son she had raised with unconditional love, the boy she had sacrificed everything for, was now conspiring with his wife to kill her. In that cramped back seat, hidden in silence, Margaret felt the cruelest betrayal of her life. From the back seat, Margaret's ears strained to catch every word. At first, she wanted to believe it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that perhaps Michael and Vanessa were speaking about someone else. But as their conversation unfolded, the truth became undeniable. Vanessa's voice was sharp, laced with greed. "She's sitting on a fortune, Michael. That old house is worth at least 200 grand. And she's got what, 50,000 in savings just lying in the bank. All that money wasted on a woman who barely leaves her home." Michael let out a frustrated sigh. "You think I don't know that? I've been patient for years. But she'll never hand it over. Every time I bring up the house, she changes the subject. She still thinks she can live there another 20 years. Vanessa leaned closer, her words cold and venomous. "Exactly. She'll never give it willingly. But if she's gone, everything becomes yours. Our dream home, Michael. The one with the big kitchen and the backyard. Don't you want that life with me? Don't you think we deserve it?" Margaret's heart sank. She pressed a trembling hand against her mouth to stop a gasp from escaping. Her son, the boy she had fed, clothed, educated, was talking about her life as if it were just an obstacle in his path. Michael's reply came after a pause, his tone heavy but determined. "I do want it. I want it more than anything. She's lived her life. It's time for us to live ours. If this is what it takes, then so be it." Tears blurred Margaret's vision as the cake on her lap grew heavier by the second. Every sacrifice she had made for him, every late night at work, every meal skipped to pay for his schooling, was being reduced to a dollar amount. 200,000 for the house. 50,000 in savings. That was the value of her life to her only son. In that moment, Margaret felt something inside her break. Margaret's mind was already spinning from what she had heard, but the next words nearly stopped her heart altogether. Michael's voice dropped lower, almost hesitant. "Richard said he's ready whenever we are. He and Linda will help smooth things over after, you know. Vanessa smirked, her tone dripping with satisfaction. Of course they will. Richard wants his share too. He's been jealous of that house for years. He thinks it should have belonged to him in the first place. Margaret's eyes widened in horror. Richard, her own brother. The man she had trusted since childhood, the one who had once protected her from bullies at school, the one she had shared her happiest and darkest memories with. And Linda, her sister-in-law, who had eaten at Margaret's table countless times, smiling and laughing like family, now both were part of this treachery. Vanessa continued, casually cruel. Linda even joked that with Margaret gone, we could finally redecorate that ugly living room. Can you imagine? They're already making plans for a house that isn't theirs. Michael chuckled bitterly. She always did hate Mom's taste. But she's right, once this is done, everything will be ours to decide. Richard will get his cut, and he'll make sure no one in the family suspects a thing. He knows how to handle the paperwork. Margaret clutched the cake box tighter, her fingers digging into the cardboard. The betrayal was no longer just from her son, it ran deeper, poisoning the very roots of her family. Her own brother, her blood, had chosen money over loyalty. In the suffocating silence of the back seat, Margaret felt her entire world collapsing. She wasn't just facing a greedy son and daughter-in-law, she was surrounded by traitors she had once called family. Her heart ached, but somewhere beneath the grief, a spark of resolve began to burn. Margaret sat frozen in the back seat, her body numb, her mind a storm of disbelief. She wanted to scream, to leap forward and confront Michael and Vanessa right then and there, to demand how her own son could plot such cruelty. But a quiet, instinctive voice in her heart told her, don't. Not now. If she revealed herself, she knew what would happen. They would deny everything, twist her words, maybe even silence her before she could escape. No, she had to think carefully. She had to be smarter than them. As the car drove on, Margaret pressed her trembling hands into her lap, forcing herself to breathe steadily. A mask of calm began to form across her face, though inside, she was shattered. She knew one thing for certain, she could not allow them to win. That night, back in her quiet home, Margaret sat at the edge of her bed, staring into the darkness. Every corner of the room seemed colder, heavier. The familiar photos on her dresser, Michael as a little boy holding his first baseball bat, the family gatherings filled with laughter, now felt like cruel reminders of a love that had died. But beneath the sorrow, determination hardened within her. They think I'm weak. They think I'm blind. They think I will walk right into their trap. But they're wrong. She pulled open a drawer and retrieved an old notebook. Its blank pages would soon become her secret weapon. She began jotting down every detail she remembered from the car ride, their words, their tone, their plan. Each sentence etched into the paper felt like reclaiming a piece of her power. Over the next days, Margaret forced herself to act normal. She answered Michael's calls with warmth, smiled at Vanessa during dinner, and nodded politely whenever Linda or Richard stopped by. On the surface, she was the same loving mother and sister. But in reality, she was studying them, watching their eyes, their movements, their false kindness. Every smile they gave her was a dagger. Every hug was a lie. And yet, she endured it, because she knew patience was her only ally. In the privacy of her room, Margaret hid a small recorder inside her purse, ready for the next opportunity. If they spoke carelessly again, she would capture every word. She began to plan quietly, who she could trust, where she could hide, and how she could turn their own plot against them. For the first time in days, she felt a spark of strength. Yes, they wanted her gone. But Margaret would not go quietly. This was no longer just about survival, it was about justice. A few evenings later, Michael and Vanessa invited Margaret over for dinner. On the surface, it seemed like a thoughtful gesture. Vanessa had prepared a lavish meal, the table set with polished silverware and lit candles, as if it were some special occasion. Margaret walked in with a warm smile, carrying a small box of cookies she had baked earlier. She moved carefully, keeping her expression soft and loving, though inside her stomach twisted with dread. They think they're fooling me, she thought. But tonight, I'll play their game. Mom, Michael greeted, kissing her cheek with exaggerated affection. You look beautiful tonight. Beautiful. The word cut like glass. He had never once complimented her appearance before, not even on her birthdays. But Margaret let out a small laugh, brushing it off as though she believed him. During dinner, Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes bright but her smile too practiced. You know, Margaret, we've been thinking a lot about the future. About making sure everything is organized, just in case something unexpected ever happens. Margaret nodded calmly, sipping her wine, though every nerve in her body was alert. Oh. What kind of future are you thinking about? She asked, her tone gentle, almost curious. Michael jumped in, his fork clinking against the plate as he gestured casually. Well, Mom, you've worked so hard all your life. You deserve peace of mind. Don't you think it's time you drafted a will? That way, you won't have to worry about what happens later. Vanessa added sweetly, it would be such a relief for you. And of course, Michael can help with all the paperwork. He's so good with details. Margaret forced a smile, her heart pounding. A will. Of course. They wanted her to sign her life away before they even carried out their plan. Their eagerness was almost laughable, if it weren't so cruel. Oh, that's very thoughtful of you both, she replied, her voice steady. Maybe you're right. Maybe I should think about it. Michael's eyes lit up, and for a brief second, his mask slipped. There was hunger in his expression, raw and greedy. But just as quickly, he replaced it with a doting smile. The rest of the dinner continued with more false affection. Vanessa asked about Margaret's health with feigned concern, while Michael kept offering to refill her glass and serve her more food. To anyone else, it would have looked like a loving family meal. But to Margaret, it was a performance, a carefully staged play where she was meant to be the unsuspecting victim. She played her part well, laughing at their jokes, thanking them for their kindness. But beneath the table, her fists clenched tightly, nails digging into her palms. Every word they spoke became fuel for her resolve. If it's a performance they want, she thought coldly, then I'll be the best actress they've ever seen. Margaret knew she could not continue her charade forever. Every day she spent around Michael and Vanessa felt like walking on a tightrope, pretending not to know they were sharpening knives behind her back. Their smiles grew sweeter, their questions more probing, their eagerness about the will harder to conceal. She had little time left. If she waited too long, she might not get another chance to turn the tide. One evening, after another suffocating dinner with Michael, Margaret drove across town to a modest, ivy-covered house at the edge of the neighborhood. It belonged to Helen, her oldest friend. They had known each other since childhood, and through every joy and tragedy, Helen had never once betrayed her trust. When Margaret finally confessed everything, the car conversation, the betrayal, the will, the involvement of Richard and Linda, Helen's face went pale with shock. My God, Margaret, she whispered, her voice trembling. Your own son. How could he, how could they? Margaret reached across the table, clutching her friend's hand. I don't know. But I do know this, if I confront them without proof, they'll deny everything. And if I do nothing, they'll find a way to kill me. I need a plan, Helen. Something they'll never see coming. Helen, though shaken, was no ordinary friend. She had worked as a nurse for nearly 3 decades before retiring, and she still carried with her the calm precision of someone who had seen life and death up close. Slowly, her fear turned to determination. There might be a way, Helen said carefully. It's dangerous, but it could work. We could make them think you're already dead. Margaret blinked. Dead? You mean? A staged death, Helen explained. With the right medication, your pulse could be slowed, your breathing shallow enough to fool anyone who isn't looking closely. I can administer it. Paramedics would declare you gone. And while they're busy celebrating your death, you'll be safe, hidden, and watching. The idea sounded like madness at first, but the more Margaret thought about it, the more it made sense. If her family believed she was gone, they would reveal their true faces. Their greed, their plans, their laughter over her belongings, it would all spill out, and she would have every word, every image, as proof. The 2 women spent hours outlining the details. Helen would secure the necessary supplies, old medical contacts and years of experience would help her. Margaret would discreetly prepare her home, hiding valuables and setting up small cameras Helen had kept from her security job days. It was a terrifying plan. If anything went wrong, the dosage, the timing, Margaret might not wake up at all. But as she looked into Helen's steady, determined eyes, she felt a strange calm. For the first time since the nightmare began, she saw a glimmer of hope. Then it settled, Margaret whispered. If they want me dead, I'll give them exactly what they want. The night of the plan arrived, and Margaret's heart thundered in her chest. Helen measured out the dose with practiced precision, her hands steady though her eyes betrayed worry. This will slow everything down, Helen whispered. Your pulse, your breathing. To anyone else, you'll look gone. But I'll be right here. Trust me. Margaret swallowed the bitter liquid, lying back on the bed. Within minutes, the world grew distant, her limbs heavy, her heartbeat faint like a drumbeat muffled under water. She heard the sound of sirens, voices shouting, the rush of paramedics storming into her home. Someone checked her pulse, muttered the word flatline, and just like that, Margaret Carter was officially declared dead. Hours later, hidden in the safety of Helen's basement, Margaret awoke groggy but alive. Her body felt drained, but her spirit burned with icy resolve. She sat before a row of monitors Helen had rigged, hidden cameras placed throughout her home, silently capturing everything. What she saw made her blood run cold. Michael entered first, not even a day after the funeral arrangements had been announced. He didn't bother to hide his smirk as he strolled through the living room, Vanessa clinging to his arm like a queen surveying her kingdom. Richard and Linda followed soon after, their voices loud, careless, dripping with greed. Vanessa laughed as she opened Margaret's jewelry box, tossing aside sentimental trinkets in search of gold and diamonds. This one's worth something. The rest? Trash. Michael ran his hand across the dining table, the same one Margaret had polished for years. We'll sell everything. Furniture, the car, even the dishes. No point keeping any of this old junk. Richard, ever the opportunist, chimed in, the house is the real prize. Once it's listed, the cash will flow. We'll split it evenly, just like we agreed. Linda's eyes gleamed as she held up one of Margaret's silk scarves. Imagine how fast we can move into that new place. I can already see the open kitchen, the new floors. Margaret's death might be the best thing that ever happened to us. Margaret's hands shook as she watched, her nails biting into her palms. The family she had loved, defended, and sacrificed for was parading through her life like vultures picking at a carcass. Not a tear was shed, not a word of sorrow spoken. Instead, they laughed, they argued over who got which piece of furniture, they dreamed of their futures, futures built on her blood. Helen placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder, but Margaret's eyes never left the screen. She forced herself to watch every second, to let their cruelty burn itself into her memory. This was the proof she needed, their greed, their betrayal, their complete lack of humanity. And as she stared at their smiling, merciless faces, Margaret made herself a silent promise. They think I'm gone. But I'll return. And when I do, the world will see who they truly are. Weeks passed in the shadows of Helen's basement. Margaret endured the loneliness and fear with only one purpose, justice. She had gathered hours of recordings, every greedy word, every mocking laugh, every plan her so-called family made for her inheritance. But evidence alone was not enough. She wanted the world to see the truth, live, undeniable, inescapable. That was when she reached out to Diane Carter, a well-known investigative reporter with a reputation for exposing corruption. When Diane heard Margaret's story, she was skeptical at first. But after reviewing the recordings and listening to Margaret's trembling voice, her doubt turned into determination. "This will shock the city," Diane said. "But more importantly, it will save your life and destroy theirs." Together, they devised the trap. Diane would arrange a meeting under the guise of a lawyer's appointment, claiming there were final documents to sign regarding the estate. Michael, Vanessa, Richard, and Linda all agreed eagerly, none of them suspecting the ambush awaiting them. The day arrived. Hidden cameras were placed strategically around Margaret's living room, now staged as the inheritance meeting. The news crew was positioned discreetly, ready to reveal themselves at the perfect moment. Margaret, pale but resolute, waited in the next room, her heart pounding like a drum. Inside, Michael lounged in his mother's favorite armchair, flipping through fake legal papers Diane had prepared. Vanessa, draped in a new dress, whispered excitedly about how soon they could put the house on the market. Richard and Linda bickered lightly over what their share should be spent on. Then, Diane signaled. The cameras switched on. The crew stepped forward, startling the four conspirators. "What the hell is this?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. And then, it happened. The door creaked open. Margaret stepped inside, her figure framed by the harsh studio lights. For a split second, the room froze in utter silence. Vanessa's glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Richard's jaw went slack. Linda clutched Michael's arm, whispering, "She's dead, she's supposed to be dead." Michael stood abruptly, his face drained of color. "Mom." His voice was barely a whisper, more a gasp of disbelief than recognition. Margaret's eyes locked onto each of them in turn, her son, her daughter-in-law, her brother, her sister-in-law. The people she had loved most, now pale specters of betrayal. Diane's voice rang out, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing tonight is not only a family reunion, it's an exposé of greed, conspiracy, and attempted murder." Margaret took a slow step forward. "You thought I was gone. You thought you could bury me along with your lies. But I'm here, and the whole world is watching." The room erupted into chaos, Vanessa sobbing hysterically, Richard stammering denials, Linda covering her face, and Michael trembling as if the ground had opened beneath him. And for the first time in months, Margaret felt the power shift. She was no longer their victim, she was their reckoning. The living room was in chaos, accusations, sobs, and stammered excuses colliding in the heavy air. But Margaret stood firm, her trembling hands holding the folder that contained the truth. She laid it on the table, her voice steady though her heart raced. "You want proof," she said coldly. "Here it is." Diane nodded, and one of the crew members connected a small device to the speakers. Within seconds, Michael's voice filled the room, clear and damning. "Once the accident happens, we'll sell the house. Richard and Linda will handle the rest." Vanessa's laugh followed, cruel and mocking. "She won't even see it coming. It'll look natural." Every word echoed like a knife in the silence. The conspirators' faces drained of all color, their lies exposed not just to Margaret, but to the cameras, and soon, to the entire public. At that very moment, two uniformed police officers, who had been waiting outside at Diane's request, stepped into the room. Their presence was commanding, their expressions grim. "Michael Anderson, Vanessa Anderson, Richard Hale, Linda Hale, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud," the lead officer announced. Michael sprang to his feet, panic in his eyes. "No, wait. This isn't what it looks like." He tried to lunge for the recorder, but an officer restrained him with practiced force. Vanessa collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't mean it. It was just talk, she screamed, but her own recorded laughter betrayed her. Richard attempted to bluster his way out, raising his voice in outrage. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove." The officer cut him off. "Save it for your lawyer." Cold steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. Linda buried her face in her hands, refusing to meet Margaret's gaze. Margaret stood motionless, watching the scene unfold. For months she had lived in fear, hiding in the shadows, wondering if she would survive another day. Now, in front of the cameras, justice was being carried out step by step. As the officers led the four away, Diane turned to the camera, her tone sharp with finality. "This is not just a story of greed, it's a story of resilience." A mother, betrayed by those closest to her, found the strength to fight back. Tonight, justice has been served. Margaret exhaled, her chest heavy but free at last. The people who had once plotted her death were now facing their own ruin. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Months had passed since that fateful day when Michael, Vanessa, Richard, and Linda were taken away in handcuffs. The trial had been swift, each of them found guilty, each facing years behind bars. Margaret sat through every hearing, her heart heavy, yet unshaken. Justice had been served. But once the courtroom doors closed, Margaret found herself standing in the silence of her own life. The house, though safe once more, carried too many scars. Every corner whispered betrayal, every room reminded her of the people she had loved but could no longer trust. So, she sold it. With the money, Margaret moved to a smaller home in a quiet neighborhood, a place where no shadows of the past could linger. At first, loneliness followed her like a ghost. Nights felt especially long. Sometimes, she caught herself reaching for the phone, thinking of calling Michael, only to remember the prison walls that separated them, and the betrayal that would never heal. Then one afternoon at the local community center, Margaret met Angela, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes but a sorrowful smile. Over tea, Angela shared her story. Her only daughter had abandoned her years ago, leaving her heartbroken and alone. Something unspoken passed between the two women, a shared pain, a recognition of wounds that only another betrayed mother could truly understand. Days turned into weeks, and their bond grew. They cooked meals together, went on long walks through the park, and spent evenings talking about everything from books to memories of happier days. Slowly, Margaret realized that she no longer felt alone. One evening, as the two sat watching the sunset from Margaret's porch, Angela reached over and squeezed her hand. "You know," Angela said softly, "we may not be related, but you're more family to me than anyone ever has been." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow, they were of gratitude. She had lost her son, her brother, her blood ties. But in return, she had gained something far more precious, a chosen family built on trust, respect, and unconditional love. For the first time in a long time, Margaret smiled with true peace. She no longer carried the weight of betrayal. She had discovered a truth that many never realize: family isn't defined by blood, but by the love and loyalty we give each other. As the last rays of the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Margaret leaned back and whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "I'm home."